In the chaos of medieval warfare, we are taught to fear the blade. We are taught to fear the arrow that strikes from the sky or the hammer that crushes bone. We believe that on the battlefield, the worst fate is death. But we are wrong. There is a silence colder than the grave. There is a moment when the chaos stops and you realize they are not trying to kill you. They are hunting you. You are no longer a warrior. You are livestock. This is not a weapon of war. This is a tool of greed, a device designed to steal a human being while he is still breathing. Welcome to the dark history of the man-catcher. To understand the man-catcher, you must first understand the currency of blood. In the 14th and 15th centuries, a noble knight was not just a soldier, he was a walking bank vault. His armor cost a fortune, his horse cost a farm, and his bloodline was worth a kingdom. Killing a peasant, nobody cared, but killing a knight, that was burning money. The code of chivalry wasn't just about honor, it was an insurance policy. If you surrender, you live, your family pays a ransom, and you go home. But there was a problem. How do you capture a tank? A knight in full plate armor is a juggernaut. He is heavy, he is lethal, and he is adrenaline-fueled. You cannot tackle him. You cannot lasso him with a rope. He will cut it. If you get close enough to grab him, he will run his sword through your gut. The battlefield needed a solution, a way to extend the reach of a man's arm and turn a predator into prey. Necessity is the mother of invention, but in this case, the mother was cruelty. The design did not start in the armory, it started in the barn. For centuries, peasants used long poles with a forked end to pin down violent animals, bulls, bears, escaped pigs. It was simple physics, leverage. A long pole allows a weak man to control a strong beast. The mechanics were primitive, two curved arms attached to a 7-foot ash wood shaft. But a human creates a challenge that a pig does not. A human has a neck, and a human wears armor. If the gap is too wide, the knight slips out. If it's too narrow, you crush his windpipe, and dead men pay no ransom. So the blacksmiths added a terrifying innovation, the spring-loaded gate. Imagine a giant pair of tongs. The moment the prongs hit the neck, the force pushes two spring doors open. Once the neck is inside, click, the doors snap shut. There is no reverse gear. Let's put you in the armor. You are a French knight at the Battle of Agincourt. You are invincible. Your steel plate deflects arrows like rain. You see a group of dirty English peasants approaching. You raise your sword to cut them down, but they don't strike. They wait. Suddenly, a heavy impact hits your throat. It doesn't cut, it grabs. You try to pull back, but the pole pulls you forward. You try to swing your sword, but the shaft is too long. You can't reach the holder. Panic sets in. It is pure physics. The leverage of a 7-foot pole against the pivot point of your neck. A small man can throw a giant to the ground with a simple twist. And once you're down in the mud, weighed down by 60 pounds of steel, the harvest begins. They drag you away, not as a warrior, but as a bag of gold coins. The shame is worse than the pain. The early man-catchers were smooth. They were designed to hold, not to harm. The goal was to keep the merchandise undamaged, but the battlefield is a messy place. Adrenaline allows men to do impossible things. Captured knights would thrash, scream, and sometimes, with enough brute force, they would slip their necks out of the smooth iron ring. The escaping prisoners would then slaughter their captors in a blind rage. The inventors realized they had made a mistake. Mercy was a flaw. So they went back to the forge, and this time they decided that if the prisoner wanted to struggle, he would pay for every inch of movement with his own flesh. They added the teeth. In the next episode, we will dissect the anatomy of death. We will look at the horrifying modification that turned the man-catcher from a lasso into a torture device. You thought being captured was the end? No, the nightmare has just begun. Pain is the ultimate teacher, and the blacksmiths of the 15th century were excellent educators. When the smooth rings failed, they looked to nature for a solution. They looked into the mouths of predators. A wolf does not have smooth teeth. A python does not have smooth jaws. Their teeth curve backward. The logic was simple. Entering the trap is easy. Leaving it requires you to rip your own flesh apart. This is the ratchet effect. The spikes were not designed to kill. Killing is easy. Killing is cheap. These spikes were designed to create compliance. If you stand perfectly still, the spikes only prick your skin. But if you struggle, if you try to run, the spikes dig into the jugular vein. The prisoner quickly learns the rule of the man-catcher. Submission is the only way to stop the pain. But turning a pole into a precision trap required more than just cruelty. It required engineering that was ahead of its time. You see, in the Middle Ages, making a sword was standard practice, but making a spring, that was dark magic. The steel had to be tempered perfectly. Too hard, and it would snap when the trap closed. Too soft, and the prisoner could bend the arms open. It was the Damascus steel of kidnapping tools. These weapons were not mass-produced like arrows. They were bespoke, custom-ordered by lords who had specific enemies in mind. Some requested spikes long enough to pierce chainmail. Others requested blunt teeth, specifically to catch noble teenagers without scarring their faces, because a scarred hostage is worth less ransom. The blacksmith became an accomplice to the crime. He wasn't forging protection, he was forging shackles. Let's look at the secret mechanism that made escape impossible. It wasn't just the spring, it was the deadlock. Look closely at the hinge. Once the arms snap shut around the neck, a small iron tongue drops into a groove. It works exactly like modern police handcuffs. Once it clicks, it cannot be opened from the inside. The knight could have the strength of Hercules, but without the key or the specific tool to release the tongue, he was trapped in a collar of iron. And the genius didn't stop at the shaft. Look at the shaft. Most pole arms have wooden handles. A sword can cut through wood, but the man-catcher was reinforced with long steel strips running down the sides, called langets. If the captured knight tried to hack the pole to free himself, his sword would just bounce off the steel reinforcements. They thought of everything. Every hope of escape was engineered out. But blueprints are one thing, reality is another. Before taking it to the battlefield, they had to test it. Historical records whisper of demonstrations in the dungeons, not on knights, but on the condemned. Imagine being the test subject. You are not fighting for ransom, you are fighting to prove a machine works. The soldier lunges, the cold steel hits your throat, the spring snaps shut faster than you can blink, the spikes pierce your skin, you gasp for air, but the collar is tight. The soldier twists the handle, you are thrown to the floor. In that moment, the dynamic of power shifted forever. A peasant with a stick had just dominated a man completely. No blood was spilled on the floor, yet the violence was absolute. The man-catcher was approved. It was ready for the greatest stage of all, the chaos of war. We have seen the birth, we have seen the anatomy, but a weapon is defined by how it is used. For a while, the man-catcher was a solitary tool for solitary kidnappings, a thief in the night. But then a general had a dark idea. Why catch one man when we can catch a king? Why stop at kidnapping when we can use these hooks to drag cavalrymen off their horses like pulling apples from a tree? The solitary trap was about to become a weapon of mass humiliation. In the next episode, the slaughter, we will witness the day the man-catcher didn't just capture a knight, it brought down an entire kingdom. And the most famous victim was not who you expect. On the morning of February 24, 1525, the sun rose over the fields of Pavia, Italy. By noon, the world had changed forever. The victim I told you about? He was not just a duke or a count. He was Francis I, the King of France, the most powerful man in Europe. a giant of a man, clad in the finest gilded armor money could buy. He charged into battle, believing he was a god of war. He left the battlefield on a leash. The man-catcher had graduated. It was no longer a tool for kidnapping rivals in the dark. It had become the Kingbreaker. The capture of King Francis proved one terrifying fact. In the face of leverage and mechanical cruelty, divine right means nothing. Gravity applies to everyone. To understand this slaughter, you have to look at the economics of the 16th century. War had become a business. Mercenaries didn't fight for patriotism, they fought for the jackpot. And on the battlefield, a nobleman on a horse was a walking lottery ticket. Why kill him? A dead knight is just scrap metal. A living knight is a pension for life. So armies developed specific catching squads. While the pikemen held the line, these hunters waited in the second row, like fishermen waiting for a shark to bite. The tactic was brutal simplicity. First, kill the horse. The knight falls. He is disoriented, concussed, weighed down by armor. Before he can stand, the hooks come out. It wasn't a duel, it was a swarm. 10 men against 1. Hooks pulling the legs, hooks pulling the arms, and the man-catcher snapping around the neck to pin the head to the mud. It was known as the Orchard of Steel, and the fruit they were harvesting was men. Imagine the terror. You are trained to fight swordsmen. You are trained to block, parry, and strike, but you cannot parry a man-catcher. You swing your sword at the pole, but it's reinforced with iron. You try to step back, but another hook grabs your ankle. You are a lion being taken down by hyenas. Every time you struggle, the spikes on your neck remind you who is in charge. The more you fight, the more you bleed. And sometimes, in the heat of the slaughter, the mercenaries got sloppy. They pulled too hard. The springs snapped too fast. The spikes found a gap in the armor, the armpit, the groin, the throat. The walking ransom became a corpse in seconds. The disappointment on the soldiers' faces wasn't grief, it was annoyance. They had just broken their piggy bank. The war ends, but the humiliation does not. The captured knights are stripped of their armor. The steel shell that defined their identity is gone. They are dragged through the mud, tied neck to neck like criminals. The man-catcher stripped them of more than just their freedom. It stripped them of their myth. The common people saw their invincible lords stumbling, bleeding, and weeping in iron collars. The illusion of nobility was shattered. The era of the knight eventually came to an end. Gunpowder arrived. Armor became obsolete. The heavy cavalry charges disappeared into history books. You would think the man-catcher would disappear with them, but evil tools have a way of surviving. They evolve, they adapt. The man-catcher left the battlefield and entered the city. It found a new master, not the mercenary, but the watchman. It was no longer hunting for ransom, it was hunting for justice. In the final episode, Legacy and the Fall, we will see how this weapon became the grandfather of modern policing and discover the disturbing reason why museums keep the real man-catchers hidden in the back rooms. The war is over. The hunt is eternal. War ended, but violence did not. When the knights disappeared, the man-catcher did not retire. It simply changed its uniform. It moved from the battlefield of honor to the halls of madness. Welcome to Bedlam. Welcome to the sanatoriums of the 18th century. Here, there were no ransoms to be collected. There was only public safety. The man-catcher became the primary tool for nurses and guards to control the mentally ill before the invention of sedatives. It was no longer hunting kings, it was hunting the broken. They called it the catchpole. It stripped the last shred of dignity from the patient. Imagine suffering from a fever of the mind, confused and scared, only to be pinned against a cold stone wall by a steel claw, treated not like a human who needed help, but like a rabid dog that needed a leash. But this desire to capture is universal. Across the ocean, in Edo period Japan, the samurai police developed a cousin to the man-catcher, the Sasumata. The philosophy was elegant but strict. A samurai should not draw his sword against a commoner unless necessary, so they used the fork to pin the criminal to the ground or trap his sword arm. It proves a fundamental truth about human history. We are obsessed with non-lethal domination. We want the power to stop you without the mess of killing you. In Europe, it became a tool of civic order. Night watchmen used it to snag thieves running down dark alleys. Firemen used blunt versions to push crowds back from burning buildings. It became mundane, it became boring, and that is why it is terrifying. The instrument of torture had become a piece of everyday furniture. So why do museums hide them? Why is the man-catcher rarely displayed in the glass cases next to the shiny swords? Because it represents a chapter of history we want to forget. In the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in the Americas, variants of this tool were used for the darkest purpose imaginable: catching escaped slaves. It's hard to romanticize a sword when you see what it kills, but it is impossible to romanticize a man-catcher when you see who it captured. It is an artifact of pure oppression. It is not a weapon of a warrior, it is the weapon of a slaver. You think the man-catcher is extinct? Look closer. Look at the pole used by animal control officers. It is the same design. Look at the riot police pushing back a crowd with shields and batons. It is the same tactic. Look at the taser. 2 barbs connected by a wire, designed to lock up your muscles and make you fall. It is a long-distance man-catcher. The steel arms are gone, but the deadlock mechanism remains. The handcuffs on a belt are just a man-catcher without the pole. We haven't stopped catching men. We just made the tools smaller, cleaner, and more efficient. The man-catcher teaches us a brutal lesson about power. The sword destroys, but the man-catcher owns. To kill an enemy is to end him. To capture an enemy is to turn him into property. And as long as human beings desire to own one another, whether for ransom, for labor, or for control, the spirit of this terrifying weapon will never die. It will just wait for the next upgrade. What is the scariest weapon in history? The one that takes your life, or the one that takes your freedom? I want to hear your debate in the comments below. If you survived this journey into the dark history of survival, strike that subscribe button and ring the bell. I am Julian. This is your arsenal. And remember, stay armed with knowledge before the trap snaps shut.